And sometimes he was a good winner, but sometimes a sore loser.
He had carried it for decades, a truth whispered in the quiet of backstage rooms, spoken by the king himself when the lights had gone down and the world wasn't listening. Elvis Presley's guitarist, his right-hand man through soaring highs and shattering lows, had promised never to reveal it. For years, he kept that promise sealed tight, even as rumors swirled and myths multiplied. But time is merciless, and as the years stretched on, he began to feel the weight of silence pressing harder than ever before. And so, before the truth could die with him, he finally spoke. His confession isn't the tabloid story some might expect. It isn't about scandal or hidden affairs or wild gossip meant to stain the legend. It is something deeper, something far more human. It is about the man behind the crown, the beating heart behind the rhinestones, and the desperate need Elvis had for someone to truly see him. For decades, fans believed they knew Elvis, the electrifying performer, the cultural icon, the voice that could break hearts and move mountains. But what this guitarist reveals forces us to look closer, to peel back the glitter and spotlight, and see the fragile man who lived beneath it all. This is not just the story of Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll. It is the story of a secret so profound that it changes the way we understand him, not as an untouchable legend, but as a human being who wrestled with fear, loneliness, and the crushing burden of greatness. And tonight, you're going to hear it all. Because when Elvis whispered to his guitarist in the stillness of those long nights, he wasn't talking to the king's audience. He was speaking to the only man he believed would carry the truth when he no longer could. The year was 1969. Elvis Presley was standing on the edge of something remarkable. After years of frustration, Hollywood movies that dulled his fire, critics whispering that the king's crown had slipped, he was ready for a rebirth. His legendary '68 comeback special had reignited his career, putting him back in black leather and back on top. But Elvis knew one thing clearly: he couldn't do this alone. He needed a band, not just any band, his band. And that's where James Burton entered the story. Known in the music world as one of the most gifted guitarists alive, Burton's fingers could set fire to 6 strings. Ricky Nelson had leaned on him, so had Johnny Cash. He had a tone sharp enough to cut glass and tender enough to make a room fall silent. To Elvis, he was exactly the man who could match his energy on stage, someone who understood not just the notes but the soul behind them. When Elvis called, James Burton answered. And from that day forward, he wasn't just a guitarist. He became a confidant, a shadow who stood just feet behind Elvis during the most iconic performances of his later career. When the spotlight hit Elvis's face, Burton was right there, holding the rhythm, steadying the heartbeat of the show. But what most people never knew was how close their connection became. Because Elvis didn't let many people in. Surrounded by bodyguards, the Memphis Mafia, fans clawing for attention, and the crushing demands of superstardom, Elvis had built walls as high as Graceland's gates. Yet in the quiet between shows, when the roar of the audience faded, he often turned to James Burton, not for fame, not for money, but for something much rarer: understanding. Elvis trusted Burton with the parts of himself he never wanted the world to see. The setup of their story wasn't glamorous. Behind the sequin jumpsuits and the Vegas lights, Elvis was a man who desperately wanted to be heard, but who feared the world only wanted the king. James Burton gave him a rare gift, the gift of listening. Night after the curtain fell, the two would sit with guitars in hand, strumming softly while the city outside pulsed with neon and noise. Elvis would talk, sometimes about music, sometimes about childhood, sometimes about his mother Gladys, whose memory haunted him long after her death. And sometimes, on nights when the weight of his fame seemed unbearable, he spoke about fear. Fear of losing himself. Fear of being forgotten. Fear of leaving the world misunderstood. And Burton, sitting quietly beside him, never interrupted. He didn't judge. He didn't rush to reassure. He simply listened because he understood that sometimes silence is the greatest kindness. And in those silences, Elvis revealed truths no one else ever heard. But to understand why Elvis confided in him, you have to understand where Elvis was in that moment of his life. By the late 1960s, the legend was already larger than the man. He couldn't walk into a diner without causing hysteria. He couldn't leave Graceland without cars chasing him down the road. He was a prisoner of the very fame he once dreamed of. The Memphis Mafia, his closest circle, gave him loyalty but not always honesty. They lived off his fortune, eager to please him, reluctant to ever challenge him. And so, when Elvis looked around for someone he could trust, someone who wasn't dazzled by the rhinestones or the roaring crowd, his eyes often landed on the man holding the guitar. Burton wasn't there to worship him. He was there to play music, to keep time, to do the work. That mattered to Elvis. Because Elvis Presley, despite the glitz, longed for realness. He missed the days when music wasn't about contracts or tour, when it was just a poor boy in Tupelo strumming chords on a battered guitar, dreaming of something bigger. Burton reminded him of that purity. With him, Elvis could strip away the title of the king and simply be Elvis. This was the setup for what would later become the revelation, the foundation on which Elvis's most vulnerable confession would be built. And that trust was tested every single night. Consider Las Vegas 1969. Elvis's residency at the International Hotel was about to become the stuff of legend. The lights, the suits, the swagger, it was a show like no other. Yet behind the curtain, Elvis was nervous, his hands shook, his confidence wavered, the critics had doubted him, the industry had nearly written him off. And so, as he stood backstage before walking out to thousands of screaming fans, he turned to Burton. "Stick with me," Elvis muttered, gripping his guitar. "Don't let me fall." Burton nodded. "I got you." It wasn't just about music, it was about trust. And that night, as Elvis strutted across the stage and reclaimed his crown, Burton's steady rhythm held him together. Every cheer from the crowd was a victory, but behind each song was the quiet presence of the man Elvis knew would never betray him. That bond only deepened as the years went on. Vegas nights bled into long tour. Hotel rooms blurred into one another. And yet, in the small hours when the glimmer of the stage was gone, Elvis would sit with Burton and open up in ways he never dared with anyone else. He would whisper about the loneliness of being adored by millions but truly known by none. About how the stage gave him life but also drained it from him. About how he feared his legacy would become bigger than his truth, that the world would remember the jumpsuits, the scandals, the spectacle, but forget the human being at the center of it all. And Burton listened, always listened. Because he knew that these weren't just the ramblings of a tired performer. They were the cries of a man carrying the unbearable weight of being Elvis Presley. And one night, when Elvis finally whispered the words that had haunted him for years, Burton realized this was more than trust. It was a secret that could change the world's understanding of the king forever. By the time the 1970s began, Elvis Presley had everything most people only dream about: fame, wealth, mansions, cars, adoring fans at every corner of the globe. Yet those who stood closest to him knew that this glittering life carried shadows that were impossible to escape. And for James Burton, standing night after night just a few feet behind Elvis, the shadows were as visible as the spotlights. From the outside, Elvis was unstoppable. His voice thundered across sold-out arenas, his jumpsuit sparkled like armor, and his smile could still bring entire audiences to tears. But when the music faded, when the doors closed and the stage lights went dark, the king was often just a man searching for peace he could never quite find. Burton saw it in the smallest moments. He'd watch Elvis emerge from a performance drenched in sweat, triumphant in front of thousands, only to slump into a chair backstage as though the applause had stolen more from him than it gave back. There was an emptiness in his eyes that no cheering crowd could fill. "People don't understand," Elvis once muttered to Burton late one night, still catching his breath after a Vegas show. "They think the stage gives me life, but some nights it feels like it's killing me." It was the first time Burton heard him confess it so plainly, the paradox of fame. The same stage that had made him immortal was also the place where he felt most trapped. And yet the show never stopped. Elvis knew the audience demanded the king, even when Elvis the man was quietly crumbling. To understand why those words carried such weight, you have to go back to the beginning of Elvis's rise. Born into poverty in Tupelo, Mississippi, Elvis never forgot the sting of being looked down upon. His childhood was carved by hardship, by the loss of his twin brother, and by the unshakable bond with his mother, Gladys. She was his anchor, his safe place. When she died in 1958, Elvis's world cracked in ways he never repaired. Burton remembered countless nights when Elvis would sit quietly, strumming his guitar, his voice dropping into a low, almost prayerful tone as he spoke of her. "She's the one who believed in me before anyone else," Elvis would whisper. "When she left, it was like somebody turned the light off inside me. I've been trying to find that light again ever since." That loss haunted him, and though the world saw Elvis as a dazzling icon, Burton knew the truth. Elvis was still that boy from Tupelo, searching for the comfort of his mother's steady hand. It was this wound, combined with the relentless machine of fame, that created the tension simmering beneath every performance. Elvis longed to be loved for who he was, but the world loved him for what he represented. Burton also witnessed the quiet rebellions Elvis staged against his own legend. One night, after hours of rehearsal for a Vegas residency, the band was exhausted. Everyone expected Elvis to call it a night. Instead, he walked over to Burton, a mischievous grin breaking across his face, and said, "Let's play something real, forget the show." And so, while the stagehands cleaned up and the hotel staff drifted away, Elvis and Burton sat together with their guitars, playing gospel songs deep into the night. Elvis's voice softened, stripped of theatrics, rising with raw emotion. He wasn't the king of rock and roll in those moments. He was just a man reaching for something pure, something that reminded him of home. Burton never forgot the way Elvis closed his eyes during those sessions, as if the music was the only place he could breathe. But as the years passed, the world gave him fewer chances to breathe. By the mid-70s, Elvis was carrying a weight no man could bear alone. The touring schedules grew relentless. The demand for perfection grew sharper, and behind the scenes, the cracks deepened. Burton remembered watching the pressure change his friend. The diet pills, the painkillers, the restless nights spent packing hotel rooms, these weren't just the habits of a man chasing relief. They were the armor of someone who couldn't stop being Elvis Presley, even when it was destroying him. Still, through all of this, Elvis trusted Burton with a rare kind of honesty. While others in his circle either avoided hard truths or enabled his excesses, Burton was the quiet presence who never demanded anything except authenticity. Elvis needed someone who saw the man, not the king, Burton would later reflect. And sometimes I think I was the only one left who did. But being that person came with its own burden. One night during a particularly grueling tour stop, Elvis sat on the edge of a hotel bed, staring at the floor while the noise of fans outside rattled the windows. "James," he said slowly, "what if all of this don't mean nothing? The money, the shows, the records. What if when it's over they forget the man and only remember the myth?" Burton stayed quiet, knowing Elvis didn't want an easy answer. Elvis leaned forward, his voice almost trembling. "Promise me something. Promise me that when I'm gone, somebody will tell them the truth about who I really was. Not just the king, but the man. Somebody's got to remember me right." Burton nodded, though the weight of that promise pressed heavy on his heart. He didn't realize then how much those words would come to define the rest of his life. Because what Elvis whispered in that moment was not just a passing fear. It was the secret Burton would hold for decades. The early tension in their story wasn't just about fame or music. It was about the chasm between the world's Elvis and the real Elvis. On stage, he was immortal. Off stage, he was painfully human, lonely, grieving, desperate to be remembered not for the legend, but for the soul inside him. And James Burton, standing quietly with a guitar in his hands, became the keeper of that truth. He carried it from hotel rooms to tour buses, from dressing rooms to after-midnight jam sessions. Every time Elvis revealed another layer of his fears, Burton locked it away, keeping it safe, knowing the world wasn't ready to hear it yet. But as the years rolled forward, and the king's health began to decline, Burton knew that one day, the burden of silence would fall entirely on him. And when that day came, when Elvis was gone, the question wasn't just whether he could keep the promise. It was whether the world deserved to finally know the truth. The applause never seemed to end. Night after night, sold-out crowds roared for the king, their cheers crashing like waves against the stage. To the audience, Elvis Presley was invincible, a man wrapped in rhinestones, moving with impossible energy, his voice carrying a power that shook the rafters. But for James Burton, who stood just a few feet behind him with a guitar in hand, the cracks beneath that brilliance were impossible to ignore. At first, they were subtle. A falter in Elvis's breathing during a ballad, a slight tremor in his hands as he reached for a water glass backstage, a heaviness in his shoulders when the curtain closed, as though each performance was another brick added to a weight he could no longer carry. Burton noticed it all, and with every passing month the tension grew tighter. The world only saw the spectacle, the booming orchestras, the karate kicks, the jumpsuits stitched with gold and silver. But behind the curtain, Elvis's life was unraveling. The demands of constant touring drained him. The medications prescribed to keep him going began to take their toll. Nights turned restless, days blurred into exhaustion. Burton would sometimes find Elvis sitting in silence, his guitar resting in his lap but his fingers unmoving. "You ever feel like the world's moving too fast, James?" Elvis asked one night, his voice low. "Like it's carrying you forward whether you want to go or not?" Burton didn't answer, he didn't need to. Elvis already knew. Because what haunted Elvis most wasn't the pace of fame, it was the fear of being swallowed by it. The conversations between them grew heavier. During long nights in hotel rooms, Elvis would talk about his dreams, the ones he still had and the ones that had slipped through his fingers. He spoke of wanting to make serious films again, to be respected not just as an entertainer but as an artist. He spoke of wanting to record gospel full-time, to go back to the music that first stirred his soul in small southern churches. But each time the reality crushed him. Contracts tied his hands. Managers pushed him toward what sold tickets, not what healed his spirit. The king belonged to the world now, and the world wanted a show. "I feel like I'm playing a part of myself I don't even recognize anymore," he whispered to Burton once. "They cheer for Elvis Presley, but what if they don't even like me, just the image of me?" Burton stayed quiet, but his heart tightened. He knew Elvis wasn't just talking to fill the silence. He was revealing the wound that never healed, the divide between the legend and the man. As the years wore on, that divide grew wider. By the mid-70s, Elvis's health began to falter in ways that no spotlight could hide. He struggled with his weight, his energy, his spirit. Some nights, he delivered breathtaking performances that reminded the world of the king's power. Other nights, Burton watched with quiet dread as Elvis pushed through songs with a voice that trembled under the strain. And yet, through it all, Elvis never let the mask slip in front of the audience. The show had to go on, the king had to endure. But in private, he leaned harder on Burton's. Elvis would come to me after a concert, Burton later admitted, and his eyes would be searching, almost pleading. Like he was asking me without words, did I still give them what they wanted? Am I still enough? It was in those quiet, desperate glances that the real Elvis lived, aching to be seen, terrified of being forgotten. The strain reached deeper than the stage. Elvis's relationships suffered under the weight of his life. Priscilla had already left, unable to stand by as the man she loved became consumed by the demands of his own legend. The Memphis Mafia, meant to be his brothers, often blurred the line between protection and indulgence. Surrounded by people, Elvis had never been lonelier. And so, time and again, it was Burton he turned to. Not because Burton had answers, but because he offered something Elvis rarely received: honesty wrapped in silence. One night after a grueling show in Las Vegas, Elvis sat slumped in his dressing room, sweat dripping from his brow. The crowd outside was still screaming his name, but his voice was a whisper. "James," he said, "I don't know how much longer I can keep being him. The king. Some nights I don't even remember who Elvis is anymore." The words hung heavy in the room. For Burton, it was like hearing the man admit he was slowly losing himself in the very crown he wore. Tension didn't just come from within Elvis, it also surrounded him. The press speculated endlessly about his health, his habits, his future. Critics began to circle like vultures, quick to pounce on any stumble. Even his fans, though fiercely loyal, carried expectations that no man could meet. Every show had to be legendary, every song had to be perfect, every gesture had to prove that the king had not lost his throne. Burton knew the truth: no man could live under that kind of pressure without breaking. And yet Elvis kept walking on stage. Because even as the weight crushed him, he couldn't bear the thought of disappointing the people who loved him. The breaking point came during a late-night rehearsal. The band had been playing for hours and everyone was drained. Elvis, dressed in casual clothes, sat on a stool with his guitar strumming slowly. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the amplifier. Then, almost without warning, Elvis stopped playing and looked at Burton with a gaze that cut straight through him. "You know, James," he said, "one day I won't be here. And when I'm gone, they'll all write their stories. Some will call me a saint, some will call me a sinner, they'll twist it how they want, but none of them will know the truth." Burton shifted, uneasy, sensing what was coming. Elvis leaned closer. His voice dropped, almost a plea. "Promise me you'll carry it. Promise me that when I can't speak for myself, you'll tell them who I really was, not the legend, the man." Burton hesitated. He understood the weight of what Elvis was asking. To hold a truth this raw meant carrying a burden heavier than fame itself. But as Elvis's eyes searched his, filled with desperation and trust, Burton nodded. "I promise." From that night on, the tension wasn't just Elvis's, it became Burton's as well. Every time Elvis walked on stage, every time the lights flared and the crowd roared, Burton played his guitar with the knowledge that he was carrying more than music. He was carrying the words Elvis had entrusted to him, the secret fear of a man who believed the world might never see the truth of who he was. And that knowledge changed everything. Because Burton knew that one day the cheering would stop, the curtain would fall for the last time, and when it did, the responsibility of preserving Elvis's truth would rest on his shoulders alone. And when that day came, when the king was gone, the silence of that promise would become almost unbearable. The summer of 1977 weighed heavily on Elvis Presley. The world still adored him, but behind the bright lights of Graceland and the glitter of Las Vegas, his body and spirit were failing. The late-night conversations with James Burton had grown darker, more urgent, as if Elvis knew that time was slipping away faster than anyone wanted to admit. Burton, always close, always steady, could feel the gravity of it. Elvis no longer spoke in passing worries or fleeting doubts. His words carried the weight of finality, the voice of a man who sensed that the end might not be far off. And then came the night when the secret finally spilled out, when Elvis pulled back the last curtain and showed Burton a piece of himself the world had never seen. It was after a concert, one of those grueling shows where Elvis had given every ounce of his strength just to make it through. The crowd, as always, erupted with adoration, never suspecting how much it cost him. Backstage, the air was thick with the smell of sweat and exhaustion. The band quietly packed up. The Memphis Mafia hovered nearby, trying not to intrude. But Elvis waved them all away. "Leave us," he said softly. "I just need a minute." When the room finally cleared, only two men remained, Elvis Presley and James Burton. Elvis collapsed into a chair, his chest rising and falling heavily, his face pale beneath the harsh dressing room lights. He motioned for Burton to sit across from him, and for a long moment neither spoke. The silence pressed in until Elvis finally broke it, his voice low, ragged, but steady enough to pierce the air. "James," he said, "you've seen me at my highest, and you've seen me at my lowest. You know me better than most. But there's something I've never told you, something I've never told anyone." Burton froze, his fingers resting nervously on the neck of his guitar. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down. Elvis leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Burton's with a desperate intensity. "They all think I'm living the dream," he whispered. "The king of rock and roll, untouchable, but truth is I've never felt more trapped, more alone." The confession cut through Burton like a knife. He had seen glimpses of this truth in Elvis's weary eyes, but to hear him say it so openly was different. Elvis wasn't speaking as a star or a performer, he was speaking as a man stripped bare of pretense. "I'm tired, James," Elvis continued. "Tired of pretending, tired of playing a part that don't feel like me anymore. You know what I wanted, all I ever wanted, to sing the songs that mattered to me, to feel close to God again through gospel. To be remembered not for the jumpsuits or the headlines, but for the man I was when the music was real." He paused, his voice breaking. "But somewhere along the way I lost him, I lost myself." Burton's chest tightened. He had no words, only silence, because he knew anything he said would sound small next to what Elvis was barring. Then Elvis spoke the words that would haunt Burton for decades. "When I'm gone, they'll all tell their stories. Some true, most lies, but none of them will know the truth, none of them will know me." He leaned closer, his voice almost pleading. "James, promise me you'll tell them. Promise me you'll let the world know that behind the king there was just a man who wanted to be loved, not worshipped. A man who wanted peace, not pressure. A man who just wanted to be himself." The room was silent except for the sound of Elvis's breathing. Burton felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders like a crown he never asked for. To carry the truth of Elvis Presley, the real man beneath the myth, was no small burden. "I promise," Burton finally said, his voice steady though his heart trembled. And Elvis exhaled, as if those words gave him a moment of release. The atmosphere shifted. Elvis leaned back, his gaze softening. His confession had cracked the image he carried so carefully, but in that room with Burton he seemed lighter. "You know, James," he said with a faint smile, "when I was a boy in Tupelo I never dreamed of all this. The money, the fame, the crowds, I just wanted to sing, that's all. And my mama, she always told me, son, no matter how far you go, don't forget who you are." He paused, his eyes clouding with memory. "But somewhere I did forget, I let the king swallow up Elvis. And I'm scared, James, I'm scared that when I'm gone, nobody will remember the boy my mama raised. They'll only remember the image, the act, the glitter." Burton wanted to speak to reassure him, but Elvis raised a hand. "Don't sugarcoat it, you know I'm right." And in that moment, Burton understood. Elvis wasn't asking for comfort, he was asking for witness, for someone to carry the truth when he no longer could. That conversation, that raw confession, became the turning point not only in their friendship but in the story of Elvis Presley himself. For the first time, Burton fully grasped the weight Elvis had been carrying all those years. The applause wasn't enough. The fame wasn't enough. The king of rock and roll, adored by millions, had never felt more unseen. Elvis's truth was simple yet devastating. He wanted to be remembered not as an icon but as a man. And Burton knew, deep down, that this was the secret he would guard with his life until the time came to reveal it. Because Elvis Presley, the man who seemed larger than life, had confessed the one thing no one expected. The king never wanted the crown in the first place. The days that followed carried an almost eerie sense of fragility. Elvis still performed, still smiled, still gave the world the king it demanded. But Burton could never look at him the same way again. Every note he played, every song they shared was underscored by the memory of that confession, the plea of a man who longed to be remembered for his heart, not his legend. And though Elvis never repeated those words again, Burton knew they lingered beneath every performance, every bow, every cheer. Because once a man reveals his deepest truth, silence can never erase it. On August 16, 1977, the world stopped. News broke that Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, the voice of a generation, the man whose music had carried millions, was gone. Fans wept in the streets, radio stations played his songs on repeat, and the gates of Graceland overflowed with flowers, candles, and prayers. But for James Burton, grief struck deeper than the headlines. He hadn't just lost the king, he had lost a friend, a brother, a man whose laughter, tears, and midnight confessions he had shared. And more than that, he had inherited the burden of a promise, one that pressed down on him harder than ever in the silence after Elvis's death. Because now, Elvis could no longer speak for himself, and only Burton carried the truth. The days immediately after Elvis's passing were a blur. Reporters swarmed Graceland. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said drugs, some said heartbreak. Others turned his death into spectacle, reducing a man's final moments into fodder for gossip. Burton, watching it all unfold, felt his chest tighten. He remembered Elvis's trembling voice in that dressing room, the words that had carved themselves into his heart. "Promise me you'll tell them who I really was." But how could he speak? How could he cut through the noise of tabloids, fans, and journalists who all believed they already knew the king? For years, Burton stayed silent. He honored Elvis's memory in the only way he knew how, by playing the music they once shared, by keeping his friend alive in every note he struck. He poured himself into performances with other artists, but none of it felt the same. Every stage reminded him of the one man he had once stood behind. Every crowd reminded him of the secret he still carried. And with every passing year, the silence grew heavier. The truth was, Burton wasn't ready. He feared the world wouldn't understand. That if he spoke too soon, Elvis's confession would be twisted, sensationalized, turned into another headline stripped of meaning. He had promised to protect the truth, not to throw it into a storm that would tear it apart. So he waited, he guarded it. He let the years roll forward while Elvis's image grew even larger in death than it had in life. The Elvis impersonators rose, the tribute acts filled theaters. The legend of the king became a global phenomenon. And yet the real Elvis, the man who sat quietly at 2 in the morning with a guitar in his hands, confessing his deepest fears, remained invisible to most. Burton lived with that divide. Every time someone spoke of Elvis as if they knew him, Burton's mind would drift back to that private room, to the raw truth Elvis had revealed. And the weight of silence pressed down harder. But silence does not erase memory. Burton found himself haunted by small details. The way Elvis's eyes had darkened when he admitted his loneliness, the way his voice cracked when he begged not to be forgotten as a man. Those words replayed endlessly, a loop that no stage lights could drown out. And slowly, Burton realized that keeping the truth locked away wasn't protecting Elvis, it was betraying him. Because Elvis hadn't asked for silence, he had asked for witness. He had asked to be remembered honestly. So Burton began to share. Not in the sensational style of tabloids or gossip shows, but in careful whispers to those who asked with genuine love. He spoke of Elvis's heart, of the nights they played gospel until dawn, of the fears Elvis carried and the longing for peace he never found. And eventually he spoke of the promise. The first time he revealed it, his voice shook. It wasn't easy to tell the world that the king of rock and roll had been a man consumed by loneliness, by fear of being forgotten, by the crushing weight of his own crown. Fans wanted the legend. But Burton knew Elvis deserved more. Elvis wasn't just the king, Burton would explain. He was a man who cared deeply, a man who laughed, who cried, who wanted love like anyone else. He told me he was afraid the world would only remember the image, but I need you to know he was so much more than that. The reactions were powerful. Some fans cried, grateful for a glimpse of the human Elvis. Others resisted, unwilling to let go of the perfect legend they'd carried for decades. But for Burton it didn't matter. He wasn't speaking for them. He was speaking for Elvis. And with every telling, the weight grew lighter. Burton realized that by breaking his silence, he wasn't betraying the king, he was fulfilling the promise. He was giving Elvis the dignity of being remembered as a man, not just a myth. Still, the burden of that truth never fully left him. There were nights when Burton lay awake, asking himself if he had done enough. If Elvis, watching from wherever his soul rested, would be satisfied with the way his story was told. He thought of the boy from Tupelo, the man who lost his mother too soon, the performer who gave everything to the world but struggled to keep anything for himself. And Burton would whisper into the dark, "I told them, Elvis, I told them." The aftermath of Elvis's confession shaped the rest of Burton's life. He became not only the keeper of Elvis's music but also of his humanity. At concerts, fans would ask, what was he really like? And Burton would smile, sometimes with tears in his eyes, and say he was real, he was kind, he was flawed, and he was human. That was the truth Elvis had wanted carried forward. Not the flawless king, not the untouchable icon, but the man who laughed too loud, who loved too deeply, who feared too much, and who gave more of himself than the world ever truly knew. The resolution of this story isn't neat, it isn't simple. Because no matter how many times Burton speaks, the legend of Elvis Presley will always loom larger than life. The gold records, the sold-out arenas, the dazzling jumpsuits, those images will never fade. But thanks to the guitarist who kept his promise, another story now exists alongside the legend, a story of humanity, of truth, of a man who longed to be remembered not for the myth but for the soul within. And perhaps that is the most fitting legacy of all. Because when James Burton finally broke his silence, he reminded the world that greatness is not measured only in fame, but in the courage to show vulnerability. That behind every icon is a person who aches, who fears, who hopes just like the rest of us. And in revealing that truth, Burton gave Elvis Presley what he had always wanted, to be remembered not just as a king, but as a man. And yet, even in sharing that truth, one question still lingers. What does Elvis's legacy mean for us today? Decades have passed since Elvis Presley left this world, but his presence has never faded. His songs still echo through radios, jukeboxes, and streaming playlists. His face still shines on posters, murals, and impersonators who dedicate their lives to keeping his memory alive. For millions, Elvis remains the king of rock and roll. But for James Burton, the man who stood just behind him on stage, the man who carried his secret, the question has always been deeper. How do we remember Elvis Presley? Do we remember him as the flawless legend, the untouchable icon wrapped in rhinestones and gold? Or do we dare to remember him as he truly was, a man who laughed, cried, stumbled, and carried fears that mirrored our own? When Burton finally revealed the confession, the plea Elvis whispered in those private hours, he wasn't trying to diminish the king's legend. He was trying to complete it, because Elvis himself had feared that the world would only see the crown, never the man who wore it. And so, every time Burton speaks of his old friend, he brings Elvis back down from the pedestal, back into the room, back into the human heart where he always belonged. Elvis wanted to be remembered as more than a show, Burton would tell audiences. He wanted to be remembered as a son, a father, a man who cared about people. That was the truth he trusted me with, and that's the truth I've carried all these years. Those words shift something in people. Fans who once only saw the dazzling image begin to see the fragile human beneath. And in that shift, Elvis becomes more real, more relatable than ever before. Because when the glitter fades, what remains isn't the legend. It's the legacy of a man who struggled, just like us, to be truly seen. The power of Elvis's legacy is not just in his music, but in the lessons of his life. He showed us the cost of fame, the way adoration can become a prison, the way success can strip away the very humanity it celebrates. And yet, he also showed us the courage it takes to give everything to others, even when your own soul is weary. For Burton, carrying Elvis's confession became a responsibility but also a gift. It allowed him to remind the world that greatness isn't about perfection, it's about impact. Elvis's greatness wasn't only in the way he could make an audience scream. It was in the way he made people feel less alone, the way his songs spoke to the brokenhearted, the hopeful, the dreamers who needed someone to put their feelings into melody. And now, through Burton's voice, Elvis's humanity stands alongside his myth. Fans who heard the confession often wept. Some said it made them love Elvis more because it revealed that even at the height of fame, he longed for the same things we all long for: peace, understanding, and love without conditions. Others said it finally made sense of the sadness they had always seen in his eyes. Burton himself often reflected on this. Elvis didn't want to be remembered as perfect. He wanted to be remembered as real. And maybe that's why his music endures, because even when the world only saw the king, the man inside the music was always reaching for something deeper. There is a strange kind of immortality in vulnerability. By allowing his truth to finally surface through Burton's promise, Elvis gave the world something far more lasting than a crown. He gave us a reminder that even legends need compassion, even kings need kindness. And that is why his story matters today. Because in a world still obsessed with images, with fame, with outward success, Elvis's confession breaks through the noise. It whispers across the decades, "Don't mistake the crown for the man, don't mistake the glitter for the soul." At Graceland, millions of fans still walk the grounds each year, tracing the steps of a man they never truly knew. They look at the cars, the costumes, the gold records. They marvel at the artifacts of a life larger than their own. But the truest part of Elvis Presley is not in the rhinestones or the Cadillacs. It's in the quiet moments, the gospel harmonies that lifted him at midnight, the laughter shared with friends, the tears shed when the weight of his crown was too heavy to bear. Thanks to Burton's courage, those moments are no longer hidden. They are part of the legacy. And maybe that's the gift Elvis left us. The reminder that every human being, no matter how great, is still just human. That behind every success story is struggle. That behind every crown is a weight. That behind every legend is a person longing to be understood. Elvis Presley was a king, yes, but he was also a man who sat with a guitar in his hands and whispered to a trusted friend, "Promise me they'll remember the man." Burton kept that promise, and because of it, Elvis will never just be a myth. He will always remain human, flawed, beautiful, aching, alive in memory. So what does this legacy mean for us today? It means that we too can choose to see beyond the images people wear. We can choose compassion over judgment, humanity over spectacle. We can learn from Elvis's struggle that no crown, no fame, no success can replace the need to be loved for who we truly are. And perhaps most of all, it reminds us that our stories matter. Elvis feared being misunderstood, forgotten as a man. Yet because of his courage to share that truth and because of Burton's loyalty in carrying it forward, generations now know that even the brightest star longed for the same light we all do, the light of being seen fully and honestly. The reflection of Elvis's life is not one of tragedy alone. It is one of hope. Because even though he carried fears, even though he struggled, his music, his spirit, and now his truth continue to inspire millions. Burton often said, "The world may never know another Elvis Presley, but the world should remember the one we had, not just the king, but the man." And in remembering the man, we keep the promise alive. So when we think of Elvis today, when his voice drifts from a radio, when his face flickers on a screen, we can choose how to remember him. We can honor the crown, or we can honor the man beneath it. Maybe the greatest legacy of all is that we can do both. Because Elvis Presley was not perfect, he was real. And in that truth lies the reason why, all these years later, we still feel his presence. Not because of the myth, but because of the humanity that James Burton finally revealed. And that perhaps is the most fitting tribute to the king. Because when the truth of a man lives on in those who loved him, death cannot silence him. Elvis may be gone, but through his humanity, he will never be forgotten. The story of Elvis Presley has been told 1,000 different ways through films, books, headlines, and endless impersonations. But the version that James Burton carried, the one he finally released before the truth could die with him, is different. It doesn't sparkle with rhinestones, it doesn't roar with applause, it whispers, it lingers, it reveals. And in that whisper lies the truest picture of Elvis we will ever have. He was not just the king, he was a son who grieved for his mother, a friend who sat awake at 3 a.m. strumming gospel songs with his band, a man who could fill stadiums with fire but felt an emptiness when the lights dimmed. He was the legend millions worshipped, and yet at his core he was simply human. James Burton's silence preserved that truth for decades. His promise carried it through the years when the world wanted only the image. And when he finally broke that silence, he gave Elvis back to us, not as a symbol, but as a man. What do we do with this truth now? Maybe we begin by remembering that behind every crown lies a weight. Behind every star is a human being who struggles in ways we may never see. And maybe Elvis's legacy, carried through Burton's confession, is a reminder to treat each person not as what they appear to be, but as who they truly are. Because Elvis's greatest fear wasn't dying young. It wasn't fading from fame. It wasn't even being criticized by the press. His greatest fear was being remembered as a myth and not as a man. And thanks to Burton's courage, that fear has been answered. We remember the man. And in remembering him honestly, we keep him alive. Not just as the king, but as Elvis Aaron Presley, the man who longed to be loved without the glitter. Think about it, the world gave Elvis endless applause, but what he craved most was understanding. And isn't that what we all want? To be seen for who we really are, not for the masks we wear or the roles we play. When we strip away the lights, the costumes, the image, we find the same need in ourselves that Elvis carried until his last breath, the need to be remembered truthfully. That is the gift Burton left us, and that is the responsibility we inherit when we tell Elvis's story. As the years continue to roll forward, Elvis's music will never fade. The sound of Can't Help Falling in Love, Suspicious Minds, If I Can Dream, these songs will outlive us all. But perhaps thanks to Burton, they will now carry an even deeper resonance. Because every note isn't just entertainment. It's confession, it's longing. It's Elvis reaching across time to remind us that he was more than the king. He was a man with a voice, with fears, with a soul that still cries out to be remembered. And when you listen closely, you'll hear it, in the soft tremble of his ballads, in the fierce growl of his rock anthems, in the gospel songs he loved most. You'll hear the truth that Burton carried all these years. Elvis Presley was more than what the world wanted him to be. He was who he was. So tonight, as you sit with this story, let yourself see him not just as an icon framed in gold, but as a man who longed to step out from behind the crown. Let yourself hear his laughter in the quiet, his prayers in the dark, his fears whispered to the only man he trusted with them. And let yourself remember him the way he wanted to be remembered, not as the king who ruled the stage, but as the man who gave his heart to the world, even when the world demanded too much of him. The crown may have been heavy, the legend may have been overwhelming, but the man beneath it remains unforgettable. Because Elvis Presley's true legacy is not just in what he performed. It is in who he was and in the courage it took to let someone, at least one person, see it. James Burton carried that truth for decades, and now so do we. And if Elvis were here now, if he could hear the stories still being told, the fans still gathering, the songs still echoing, maybe he'd finally feel the peace he longed for. Maybe he'd know that the world has not forgotten the man beneath the crown. Because thanks to his guitarist, the truth will never die. As we close this chapter, let this story stay with you. The next time you hear Elvis's voice, don't just hear the king. Hear the man, hear the son, hear the friend. Hear the human being who whispered his greatest fear to a trusted confidant. And remember, greatness doesn't come from being perfect. It comes from being real. If you've been moved by this story, share it. Keep Elvis's truth alive. And if you want to hear more untold stories, the kind that strip away the glitter and reveal the heart, be sure to subscribe because this is just the beginning. Because the next story we share will take you even deeper into the moments history tried to hide. Moments that prove that even legends bleed, even icons falter, and even kings, especially kings, carry secrets that deserve to be heard. Elvis Presley once feared he would only be remembered as a myth. Tonight, we remember him as something greater, a man. And in the end, that is the legacy that will never die.